What would you do if your last $10 could either keep you alive for one more day or save something that might not survive the night? On the day he turned 18, Ethan Cole was thrown into the cold with nothing but a thin jacket and a choice no one should have to make. When he spent his final dollars on a dying horse, everyone else had given up on it seemed like a mistake that would cost him everything. But what he uncovered afterward would change not just his life, but the kind of man he chose to become. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And it all started with a decision he almost walked away from. Ethan Cole turned 18 on a morning that felt colder than it should have been even for Montana. The kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin, but pressed inward like the world itself had decided to make things harder than necessary. There was no ceremony marking the day, no sense that anything important had happened. No one gathered to say goodbye. No one told him he'd be okay. It was just a quiet office, a clipboard, a signature, and a door that opened one way. A social worker stood across from him, arms folded too tightly, as if she'd practiced this moment enough times to stop feeling it. "You'll figure it out, Ethan," she said, offering a thin, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Ethan didn't answer. He just nodded once, not trusting himself to say anything that might come out wrong or worse, honest. He stepped outside with everything he owned packed into a worn duffel bag. A thin jacket that wasn't built for this kind of weather, a few changes of clothes, and $10 folded carefully in his pocket. That was it. That was the sum of 18 years. Behind him, the door clicked shut. For a second, he just stood there. Then the wind hit him. It came sharp and sudden, slicing through the fabric of his jacket like it wasn't even there. His breath caught in his throat, turning to white mist as soon as it left him. The sky above was a dull, endless gray. No sunlight, no warmth, no sign that anything out here cared whether he stayed or left. And just like that, Ethan understood something he hadn't fully grasped until now. There was no one waiting for him. No plan. No safety net. No second chance tucked somewhere behind him. Just the road in front of him and the cold. He started walking. Red Creek was a small town, the kind where people grew up knowing each other's names, where routines ran deep and didn't make room for strangers. Ethan passed storefronts glowing with warm yellow light. Inside, people sat with coffee cups in their hands, leaning into conversations and their laughter muffled behind glass. He slowed as he walked past a diner. Through the window, he could see a plate piled high with eggs and bacon steam curling upward into the air. The smell hit him a second later. Rich, heavy, alive. His stomach tightened instantly, a sharp, hollow ache that made him swallow hard. $10. He pressed his hand against his pocket. That money could mean food, one decent meal, maybe two if he stretched it, or it could mean something else he didn't know what yet. But once it was gone, it was gone. He kept walking. No one stopped him. No one asked if he was okay. A few people glanced his way, but their eyes moved on just as quickly, like he didn't quite register. And that was when it settled in. Loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about not mattering. Ethan pulled his hands deeper into his pockets, trying to keep what little warmth he had left. His fingers were already going numb. Where am I going to sleep tonight? The question came without an answer. He walked another block, then another, the wind pushing at his back now, as if urging him to keep moving, to not stop long enough to think too much. He was just about to turn into a narrow alley to get out of the wind when he heard it. Voices, loud, rough, alive. Not the quiet murmur of a cafe or the soft clink of dishes in a diner, but something heavier. Men shouting, engines idling, metal clanging. Animals. Ethan paused, The sound carried from down the road, pulling his attention like a thread. He followed it. A faded sign leaned crooked beside the road, half buried in snow and dirt. Red Creek Livestock Auction. Ethan stared at it for a second. He had no real reason to go in there. No money to spend, no business with livestock. But the noise, the movement felt like something. Like the only place in town where things were still happening instead of just passing by him. So he stepped forward. The ground changed under his boots as he approached packed dirt and mud, frozen into uneven ridges. Pickup trucks were lined up in loose rows, their engines' still warm exhaust rising into the cold air. The smell hit him next. Diesel fuel, wet straw, manure, something raw and real. Men in heavy coats and worn boots stood in small groups, talking, laughing, arguing over prices like it was second nature. Ethan immediately felt out of place. He didn't belong here. Not in the way they did. Not in the way they carried themselves like they'd been doing this their whole lives. Still, he kept walking. At the center of the yard, animals were being led through one by one. Horses, cattle strong, healthy, valuable. Men stepped forward to inspect them, checking legs, teeth muscle. Bids were called out quickly, numbers jumping in sharp bursts. Everything here had a purpose, a value. Everything here mattered if it could work. Ethan stayed at the edge of the crowd, careful not to draw attention. And then, almost without realizing it, he drifted toward the back. The noise faded a little there. The energy dropped. Fewer people. Fewer voices. This part of the yard felt different. Colder, less interest, less urgency. Here the animals weren't being fought over. They were being dismissed. Ethan slowed. In a small pen near a leaning fence, he saw her. A mare lying on her side on damp straw. She was thin, too thin. Her ribs showed clearly beneath a dull matted coat that looked like it hadn't been properly cared for in a long time. One of her back legs was stretched awkwardly, as if she didn't trust it enough to pull it in. Above the pen, a rough sign hung loosely from a nail. Meat only, no guarantee. A couple of men passed by, barely glancing at her. Ethan almost did the same. But then the mare opened her eyes. They weren't wild or panicked. Not angry, not pleading, just tired. Deep quiet and empty in a way that felt familiar. Ethan stopped. For a moment, the rest of the yard faded. He wasn't looking at a broken animal. He was looking at something that had already been decided on, written off, finished before it was actually gone. And something about that hit him harder than it should have, because it felt too close. "Don't waste your time, kid." The voice came from behind him. Ethan turned to see a tall man stepping closer, broad shoulders, thick coat boots that looked like they'd never seen a crack or tear. His face was weathered but sharp, his expression carrying a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Hank Rourke. Even Ethan knew as he was, could tell the kind of man he was. Money, land, authority. Hank's gaze swept over Ethan, taking in the thin jacket, the worn bag, the way he stood like he didn't quite know where to put himself. Then Hank looked back at the mare and let out a short laugh. "That mare ain't a horse anymore," he said. "She's a problem with legs." A couple of men nearby chuckled. "She won't last the week," one of them added. Hank shook his head, still amused. "You looking to buy yourself a funeral?" Ethan didn't respond. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against the folded $10. He felt heat rise to his face, even in the cold. They're right. He knew they were right. He didn't have a place to keep her. Didn't have food. Didn't have experience. Hell, he didn't even know where he was sleeping that night. Buying that horse would be stupid. He turned away, took a step, then another. The laughter behind him faded, but something else didn't. The image of those eyes. If I walk away, she's dead. The thought came uninvited. Then another followed sharper. If I keep walking, what does that make me? Ethan stopped. The wind cut across the yard again, colder, now sharper. He closed his eyes for a second, then turned back. Marty Briggs, the auctioneer, was already moving on, clearly eager to be done with this part. Last one, he called out, voice flat. Meat price. Anybody silence. No one moved. Hank folded his arms, smirking like he already knew how this would end. Ethan stood halfway between the gate and the pen. He could leave. Right now. He could keep his $10. He could find food. Maybe a place to sit. A way to get through the night. Or he looked at the mare again. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were still open. Ethan's heart started pounding. Loud, fast, unsteady. Before he could think too much, before he could talk himself out of it, he raised his hand. $10. His voice was rough, but it carried. For a second, everything went quiet. Marty blinked like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Then Hank laughed, loud, sharp, and the others followed. But Ethan didn't lower his hand. Marty shrugged and brought the hammer down. Sold, just like that. The mare was his. Someone asked him if he had a trailer. Ethan shook his head. Hope you got a mansion waiting for her, Hank called out, still smiling. Ethan ignored him. A man named Ray Dalton, a driver who'd been standing off to the side, watched Ethan for a long moment. He didn't laugh. He just sighed. I can drop her near the tree line, he said. That's all I can do. Ethan nodded. That's enough. Getting the mare onto the trailer was harder than Ethan expected. She couldn't stand on her own. He had to brace her weight, one hand on her neck, the other pushing gently at her side. Easy. Easy, he murmured. I got you. He wasn't sure if that was true. By the time the truck rolled away from the auction, the sky was already darkening. Ray dropped them off at the edge of a wide, open stretch of land near a thin line of trees. Not a home. Not even close. Just a place where no one would immediately tell them to leave. Ray cut the engine and looked over at Ethan. You sure about this, kid? Ethan hesitated. For a split second, he almost said no. But then, he just nodded. Ray didn't argue. He drove off taillights, fading into the gray distance. And then it was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan stood there, the wind pressing against him, the cold settling in deeper now that there were no buildings to break it. No money, no food, no shelter, no one coming back. Just him, and a dying horse, and winter closing in. He moved because he had to. Found a torn blue tarp tangled in a fence, a few broken boards, some old rope, a bent sheet of metal. He worked with numb fingers, tying the tarp between a low tree branch and a leaning post. The wind kept tearing it loose, forcing him to start over again and again. His hands burned, then went numb. Behind him, the mare Dusty lay still, her breathing slow and uneven. Ethan dragged what dry straw he could find beneath an old trailer frame and spread it around her. When he lifted her head slightly, she let out a faint pain sound. I know, he said softly. I know it hurts. The shelter he built barely deserved the name. Crooked, weak, open to the cold, but it was all they had. Night came fast. The temperature dropped even faster. Wind pushed under the tarp, carrying fine snow that settled on everything. Ethan took off his jacket and laid it over part of Dusty's body. He knew it was a bad idea. He knew he needed it, but he couldn't take it back. He curled up beside her, pulling his arms tight to his chest. His stomach ached with hunger. His throat was dry. His whole body shook uncontrollably. Dusty's breathing was shallow, uneven, like it could stop at any moment. Ethan kept one hand on her neck just to feel that she was still there, still alive. "Don't die tonight," he whispered. "Please." He wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. Snow slipped under the edges of the tarp. Cold seeped into his bones. And as his eyes finally closed, one thought pressed heavier than anything else. I made a mistake. A real one. And out here, there might not be a second chance. Was Ethan's choice to save that dying horse brave, or the biggest mistake of his life? If you were in his place, would you have walked away or stayed? Tell me what you think, and don't forget to subscribe before we dive into the most intense part of the story. The next morning, Ethan woke because the cold had found every part of him. It was not the kind of waking that came slowly. It hit him all at once, the stiff ache in his back, the sharp sting in his fingers, the hollow pain in his stomach, the hard ground beneath his ribs. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the wind pulled at the tarp above him, snapping one loose corner, hard enough to scatter a thin spray of snow over his face. He opened his eyes. Gray morning light pressed through the torn blue tarp. One side had sagged during the night, weighed down by frost and snow. The crooked shelter still stood, but barely. It looked as tired as he felt. Then Ethan turned his head. Dusty was still there. The mare lay on the damp straw, her body too still beneath the coat he had draped over her. For one terrible second, Ethan thought she was gone. He pushed himself up too quickly, dizziness flashing behind his eyes, and crawled to her side. His hand went to her neck. There. Faint, but there. Warmth, a weak breath. Dusty was alive. But not better. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. When Ethan tried to lift her head a little, she barely responded. Her body felt heavy in a way that scared him, as if life was still inside her, but had sunk too deep to reach. Ethan sat back on his heels and stared at her. Buying her had only taken one moment. Saving her might be impossible. He looked toward Red Creek in the distance. The town was hidden beyond the trees and the white-gray morning, but he knew it was there. Warm buildings, people, food, knowledge, something, anything. If he stayed here doing only what he already knew, Dusty would die. And maybe he would too. So Ethan pulled the tarp tighter, packed what little straw he could around her body, and tucked his jacket over her shoulders again. Before he left, he leaned close and whispered, "Stay alive till I get back." Then he stood, grabbed his empty duffel, and started walking. The road into Red Creek felt longer than it had the day before. Ice crusted over the mud in uneven patches, and Ethan's shoes were still wet from the night. Every step sent cold through his feet. His stomach cramped so badly that twice he had to stop and breathe through it. He passed houses with smoke rising from their chimneys. Through one window, he saw a family moving around a kitchen table. Someone poured coffee. Someone laughed. Someone opened an oven, and a warm, golden light spilled out. Ethan looked away. He thought about knocking on a door, just asking for bread, just asking for a place to sit for a minute. But then he imagined the faces, the pause, the quick look at his dirty clothes, his thin jacket, his worn bag. He kept walking. The library sat near the center of town, a brick building with frost gathered along the window frames. When Ethan stepped inside, the heat struck his skin so suddenly it hurt. His fingers burned as feeling came back into them. He stood just inside the door for a moment, trying not to look like someone who had come in only because he was freezing. The librarian glanced up, then looked back down. No one stopped him. That was enough. Ethan found the agricultural section in the back. He pulled down books with cracked spines and faded covers, basic horse care, farm animal first aid, livestock nutrition, winter stable management. He stacked them on a table and opened the first one with hands that still trembled. Most of it made him feel stupid. Words he didn't know. Diagrams he had to stare at for too long. Instructions that seemed simple on the page, but impossible with no barn, no supplies, no money. But he kept reading. He learned that a starving horse couldn't simply be fed too much too fast. He learned that cold and damp could finish what hunger had started. He learned to check gums, breathing ears, legs, hooves. He learned that warmth mattered, dry bedding mattered, water mattered, patience mattered. He found a pencil stub and wrote notes on the back of an old flyer. Small amounts. Keep her dry. Warm water if possible. Don't force. Watch the breathing. Massage gently. He stared at those last two words for a long time. Gently. Nothing in Ethan's life had taught him much about gentleness. Not the system, not the streets. Not the way people looked through him like he was already gone. But Dusty needed it. So he wrote it down twice. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to the lot with more knowledge than he had left with, but no food and no supplies. The wind had picked up again. Dusty was still lying beneath the shelter, snow gathered around the edges of her body, where the tarp had failed to block it. "I'm back," Ethan said, though he didn't know if she could hear him. He gathered snow in an old metal can he found near the fence and tried to melt it over a small fire made from broken twigs. The fire smoked more than it burned. The wind kept flattening the flame. His hands shook so badly he nearly spilled the water twice. When he finally brought the can to Dusty, the water was barely warm. She drank only a few mouthfuls before turning away. Ethan tried not to panic. He moved to her back leg and began rubbing gently the way the book had said. Dusty flinched. Her muscles tightened. Ethan pulled his hands back immediately. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing." That was the truth of it. Everything in the books had sounded clean and ordered. Out here, everything was wet, cold, painful, and uncertain. By dark, he had done almost nothing. Dusty still lay weakly on the straw. Ethan sat beside her, watching each breath leave her body in faint white clouds. For the first time, he understood that wanting to save something was not the same as being able to save it. Will alone was not enough. He needed food, supplies, time, luck, and he had almost none of them. The next days became a loop. Morning library, afternoon back to Dusty, night cold. Again and again, Ethan read until the words blurred. He learned to notice things he never would have seen before. The speed of Dusty's breathing, the flick of an ear when he stepped close, the way her eyes followed light, the way her injured leg twitched when he touched too high. None of it looked like recovery, but none of it looked like death either. That was what trapped him. If Dusty had simply stopped breathing, the decision would have been taken from him. If she had stood up, the hope would have been easy. Instead, she stayed somewhere in between, too weak to live, too alive to abandon. At night, Ethan began talking to her, not because he thought she understood every word. Maybe she understood none of it. But the silence under that tarp was too large. If he didn't speak, he could hear everything else: the wind, his hunger, his fear, Hank's laughter, the social worker's empty voice. So he talked. He told Dusty about the library, about the books, about how useless he felt every time he read a sentence and still didn't know what to do. He told her he had never owned anything important before. He told her he didn't know if buying her had been brave or foolish. Sometimes he asked her the question that kept circling in his mind. "Am I saving you?" he whispered one night or just making it take longer? Dusty only breathed. That was answer enough to keep him there. But Dusty needed more than Ethan's voice. She needed feed. So Ethan went to Duke Miller's supply store. The place smelled of leather grain oil and warm wood. Bags of feed were stacked along the walls. Horse blankets hung from hooks. Ropes, brushes, salves, and tools lined the shelves. Everything Dusty needed was there. Everything Ethan could not buy. He stood near the counter for too long before speaking. "Do you have anything damaged?" he asked. Like a torn bag or old feed you're throwing out, Duke Miller looked him over slowly. His eyes took in the dirty jacket, the wet shoes, the hollow face. "You got money." Ethan said nothing. Duke's expression hardened. "This ain't a charity. Move along." Ethan swallowed. "There's a horse. She'll die if then you shouldn't have bought it." The words landed harder than Ethan expected. He left the store with the bell above the door ringing behind him like a final judgment. Outside, the wind made his eyes water. Or maybe it wasn't the wind, because Duke wasn't completely wrong. That was what hurt. After that, Ethan started searching wherever people threw things away. Behind the diner, he found bits of stale bread wrapped in paper. Near an old warehouse, he found frayed rope and dirty cloth. Once near the auction yard, he found a few armfuls of dry straw that had fallen from a truck. Some days he found enough to help. Some days he found nothing. Whatever was best went to Dusty. Whatever was left, if anything, went to him. Hunger made him light-headed. The cold slowed his thoughts. But the responsibility of Dusty gave shape to his days. Before her, Ethan had only needed to survive the next hour. Now he had to ask whether she had water, whether the tarp would hold, whether her leg was swelling, whether she would make it through another night. It was too much. And somehow, it was also the only reason he kept moving. Then one evening, after Ethan had spent too long in town and returned as the sky was going dark, something changed. He approached the shelter expecting the same sight, Dusty lying still barely aware. "Hey, girl," he called softly. Dusty's ear moved. Just a little. So little he almost thought he imagined it. Ethan stopped. Dusty. Her eye opened halfway. She didn't stand, didn't lift her head, didn't make any sound. But she knew he was there. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, afraid to breathe too loudly. He placed a hand on her neck. For the first time, she didn't flinch. "You heard me?" he whispered. It was nothing. To anyone else, it would have been nothing. But to Ethan, it felt like a match struck in a dark room. After that, he became more careful, more systematic. He tied the tarp better with rope he had found. He used the bent metal sheet to block the strongest wind. He divided the water into smaller amounts. He rubbed her shoulders and legs more slowly. He learned where pain lived in her body and where touch calmed her. He begged for straw when he had to. Some people ignored him. Some snapped at him. One man tossed a half bale from the back of a truck and said, "Take it and get out of here." Ethan took it. He didn't argue. Pride didn't keep a horse alive. The bond between them did not arrive like magic. It came in fragments. Dusty breathing easier when Ethan spoke. Dusty watching him leave. Dusty no longer tightening every muscle when his hand touched her neck. She became more than the horse he had bought. She became the first living thing that needed him to stay. And that made what happened next even harder. The weather turned. Ethan saw the warning in an old newspaper at the library. A heavy snowstorm was expected by nightfall. Around town, people prepared without panic because they had homes, barns, firewood food. They brought animals inside, reinforced doors, filled trucks, bought supplies. Ethan watched them, and understood that he had almost nothing to prepare with. The tarp was already torn. The ground was exposed. Dusty still could not stand. If the storm hit hard enough, it could kill her in hours. He tried to find a better place, a shed, a stall, an empty corner of a barn, but no one wanted a sick mare on their property. "That thing dies in my barn," one man said. "I'm the one cleaning it out." Ethan walked back without answering. Snow had already begun to fall. That night, he checked what they had left. A handful of dry straw, a few hard pieces of bread, one can of melted snow. Not enough. He put the straw in front of Dusty and watched her chew slowly, painfully. His own stomach twisted so sharply he almost doubled over. He took a piece of bread from his pocket, stared at it, then broke it in half. Half for now, half for later. Though later was starting to feel like a promise the world had no intention of keeping. In his head, voices returned. Duke's voice. "Then you shouldn't have bought it?" Hank's voice. "You're buying yourself a funeral." For the first time, Ethan had no strength left to argue with them. The wind rose after dark. The tarp began to thrash violently, pulling at the knots. Ethan tried to hold one corner down, but his fingers were too numb to grip. Dusty's breathing grew heavier. Her body trembled under the coat. Ethan pulled the coat higher around her shoulders, leaving himself in only a thin shirt. Then he sat with his back against the fence post. His vision blurred. Sleep crept toward him, soft and dangerous. He knew he couldn't close his eyes for long. He tried to stand and gather more wood, but his legs folded beneath him. He crawled back to Dusty and pressed his forehead against her neck. She was still breathing. Barely. The words came out before he could stop them. "I can't save you." His voice cracked, then quieter, smaller. "I can't even save myself." No answer came. Only wind. Only snow. Only two exhausted bodies beneath a failing shelter. Ethan sat there for a long time, and then a strange clarity came over him. If he left now, maybe he could still reach town. Maybe the church would be open. Maybe a gas station. Maybe someone would let him sit near a heater until morning. If he stayed, he might die with Dusty. He looked at her. Her eyes were closed. Ethan told himself leaving wasn't betrayal. It was survival. Slowly, he stood. He picked up his duffel bag. He pulled the tarp tighter around Dusty, tucking it down, as if that could make up for what he was about to do. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he turned and walked away. At first, his body felt lighter. Every step away from the shelter was a step toward warmth, toward a chance, toward something that made sense. But his chest grew heavier. He didn't look back. He forced himself forward. The wind struck him full in the face as he neared the trees. He shoved a hand into his pocket and felt only emptiness where the $10 had been. That stopped him. He remembered the auction, the laughter, Hank calling Dusty a corpse, Marty's bored voice, his own hand rising. No one had made him do it. For once in his life, Ethan had chosen something. Not because it was smart, not because it was safe, because something inside him had refused to let another living thing be thrown away without a fight. He stood in the snow, shaking. Dusty's eyes came back to him the way they had looked in that pen. Not begging, not angry, just emptied by a world that had already decided she wasn't worth saving. Ethan knew that look. He had worn it himself when the center door closed behind him. If he walked away now, he might survive. But something in him that had only just begun to live would die out there with her. He turned around. The first step back was harder than all the steps away. By the time he reached the tarp, Dusty had not moved. Ethan dropped his bag, fell to his knees beside her, and placed his hand on her neck. His voice was hoarse, almost gone. One more try. Then the storm truly came down. The wind sharpened so quickly, it seemed to change the shape of the whole night. Snow no longer fell from above. It swept sideways across the open lot, driving under the tarp, through every gap into Ethan's eyes and mouth. The tarp snapped and pulled like a sail about to tear loose. Ethan moved without thinking. He dragged more straw against Dusty's body, jammed his duffel bag into the widest gap, shoved the bent metal sheet harder into the windward side of the shelter, retied ropes with fingers that barely worked. Each small task drained him. But this time, he did not think about leaving. He stripped off his outer layer and laid it across Dusty's neck and shoulders. The cold bit into him immediately, but Dusty was weaker. That was all that mattered. He tried to melt snow again, shielding the tiny flame with both hands, while smoke blew into his face. The fire went out twice, then a third time. He cursed under his breath, struck it again, and kept going. When he finally had a little water, he held the can to Dusty's mouth. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Just breathe. We made it this far." She drank only a little. He rubbed her neck, her shoulders, her front legs, slow and careful. At times, she twitched. At times, she went frighteningly still. Ethan didn't know if he was helping, but he knew stopping meant the end. Sometime after midnight, his body began to fail. His hands shook so badly he could no longer tie knots. His lips had gone numb. His thoughts broke apart before he could finish them. The wind sounded almost human, calling from beyond the tarp, telling him to lie down, to rest, to let go. He fell beside Dusty and stayed there too long. A heavy sleep pulled at him, warm almost. Wrong. He forced his eyes open and pressed his palm against Dusty's neck. Her breath moved under his hand. Weak, but there. "Don't quit on me," he said. Then after a moment, "I won't quit on you." He repeated it until the words stopped meaning anything and became only sound. A rhythm. A rope tying him to the world. Near dawn, when the storm paused for just a few seconds, Dusty moved. At first, Ethan thought she was convulsing. Her legs shifted under her, her neck stretched forward, her front knees bent. Then he understood. She was trying to get up. Ethan froze. No, easy. Dusty pushed. Her hooves slipped on the wet straw. Her thin body trembled violently. Then she crashed back down hard. Ethan lunged forward, terrified she had hurt herself worse. He put both hands on her neck. "Easy, girl, easy." But Dusty moved again. Not panic, not fear, effort. She was trying to live. Ethan backed off just enough to let her move, staying close enough to help. Dusty folded her front legs under her and pushed again. Her shoulders shook. Her back leg faltered almost immediately, and she went down a second time. Ethan's throat tightened. "Easy. Easy, girl." But hope had already lit inside him, dangerous and bright. On the third try, the Dusty rose higher. Ethan braced himself against her shoulder, not pulling, only steadying. He could feel every tremor in her body. Her breath came in white bursts. Her hind hoof slipped once, and Ethan thought she was going down again. But Dusty shifted her weight, corrected, held. Slowly, painfully, impossibly, the dying mare stood on all four legs. For a moment, the storm seemed to go silent. Ethan stood with both hands against her neck, unable to speak. Dusty lowered her head and touched her muzzle lightly against his chest. It wasn't a miracle that fixed everything. It was something smaller, something stronger. The creature with almost nothing left had still chosen to stand. A broken sound came out of Ethan, half laugh, half sob. Then the tears came hot against his frozen face. He cried because the cold was still there, because the hunger was still there, because nothing was easy now. But for the first time since the center door closed behind him, staying had meant something. By morning, the storm weakened. The lot was buried in white. The tarp still stood barely. Dusty could not stand long, and Ethan helped her settle back down carefully. But she no longer looked like a creature waiting to die. She had fought. So had he, and sometimes that was the beginning of everything. In the days after the storm, Dusty's recovery came slowly. She drank more, ate more, lifted her head when Ethan approached, stood for a few minutes, then longer. Ethan kept going to the library, but now the books made more sense because every page connected to something real. He learned not to rush, not to feed too much, not to let hope make him careless. Each small improvement in Dusty seemed to build something in him, too. When she stood longer, he stood straighter. When she took a step, he felt one step less lost. Eventually, Dusty could walk slowly around the lot. That was when Ethan started thinking about work. Not big work, not hard pulling, just small things. He tied a rope to a bundle of dry wood and guided her carefully. "Easy," he said. Dusty stepped forward, slowly, but she pulled. The bundle moved. It was nothing to any real rancher. To Ethan, it was proof. Soon after, he helped an older man near the road move a few pieces of firewood to his porch. No pay, just help. But someone saw, then someone else. The first real job came from Linda Harper, a woman who lived at the edge of town. Her back lot had been blocked by snow and fallen branches. She saw Ethan walking Dusty past her fence and called out, "That horse can still pull, Ethan," glanced at Dusty. Slowly, Linda crossed her arms. "Slow's fine if the job gets done." So Ethan did the job slowly, carefully. He broke it into pieces. He watched Dusty's breathing. Stopped when she needed stopping. It took longer than it should have, but by the end, the path to Linda's woodshed was clear. Linda handed him a few folded bills. Ethan stared at the money in his palm. It wasn't much, but it was the first money he had earned with Dusty. Not luck, not pity, work. Linda also gave him a small sack of old oats. "For her," she said. Ethan's throat tightened. "Thank you." From Linda, word spread. Not fast, not loud, just enough. The kid with the sick mare cleared Linda's back lot. Someone needed wood moved. Someone needed a barn entrance cleared. Someone needed feed sacks shifted from a truck to a shed. Ethan took jobs that Dusty could handle. He refused the ones that were too much, even when he needed the money badly. That surprised people. They expected desperation to make him careless. But Ethan had learned something under that tarp. Dusty was not a tool to use up. She was the reason he was still standing. Over the weeks, they became a team. Dusty learned his voice. A soft command made her stop. A touch on the rope shifted her direction. Ethan learned her rhythm when her leg ached, when she was tiring, when they could continue, when they absolutely had to stop. They were not fast, not impressive, but they were reliable. Ethan showed up on time, did what he said he would do, took care of Dusty before taking payment. And slowly, Red Creek began to look at him differently. First with pity, then curiosity, then respect. He still went to the library. But now the books were no longer distant and confusing. He read about harness safety, hoof care, nutrition, winter shelter. He bought a used brush, cheap salve, better rope. He patched the shelter until it became something stronger. He wrote every dollar earned and every dollar spent in a small notebook. He was no longer living only by instinct. He was planning. And planning meant he believed there might be a future. Near the end of winter, Hank Rourke came back. Ethan was brushing Dusty's neck when he saw the black pickup stop near the fence. Hank stepped out, coat expensive boots, clean face tight. The same man who had laughed at him at the auction now stood silent, staring at the mare he had called a problem with legs. Dusty stood calmly beside Ethan. That alone said enough. Hank cleared his throat. "I heard you're taking small hauling jobs." Ethan kept one hand on Dusty's neck. "Depends on the job." Hank looked like he hated every word he had to say. His ranch had taken damage in the storm. Part of a storage roof had collapsed. His main tractor was dead. The road into the feed shed had turned too narrow and muddy for the bigger equipment. Cattle needed hay moved before nightfall. 3 men had already tried. 3 had given up. Hank needed something slow, careful, steady. For a few seconds, Ethan said nothing. He could refuse. He could remind Hank of every word from the auction. He could let the man feel what it was like to be dismissed when help was needed most. And part of Ethan wanted to. Then Dusty lowered her head beside him and breathed out softly. Ethan remembered the night he had almost walked away. He remembered what it felt like to decide whether another living thing deserved to be left behind. Hank was not the cattle in his barn. Hank was not the workers who depended on that ranch. Hank was not the land buried under snow. Ethan looked at him and said, "I'm not doing it for you." Hank didn't answer. "I'm doing it because it needs doing." They arrived at Hank's ranch under a gray morning sky. The job was harder than Ethan expected. The ground was slick. The paths were narrow. The hay was heavy. Hank grew impatient within the first hour. Ethan stopped Dusty and looked at him. "You rush her, you lose the job." Hank opened his mouth and then closed it. After that, he followed Ethan's pace. They moved one load at a time, cleared one section at a time, hauled hay slowly but surely until the shed entrance opened and the cattle were fed before dark. Dusty was tired by the end, but she was still standing. Hank looked at her for a long moment, then at Ethan. Didn't think she had it in her. Ethan ran a hand along Dusty's neck. Most people didn't. After that, things changed. People stopped calling him the kid who bought the dying horse. They started calling him when something needed doing. Ethan earned enough to buy a steady feed for Dusty, enough to rent a corner of an old barn at the edge of town, enough for a better coat, enough for meals that didn't come from trash or luck. He was still not rich, still tired most nights, still working harder than anyone noticed. But his life no longer hung by a thread. Each evening, under a roof that held back the wind, he brushed Dusty's coat while she stood warm and quiet beside him. The sound of her breathing filled the barn with something steady. And for the first time, Ethan felt it. Not victory, not comfort exactly. Something simpler. Stability. A life that did not feel like it might vanish before morning. He had gone from surviving to living. And it had started with the one thing everyone told him was already worthless. By the time life in Red Creek settled into something steady, Ethan had learned not to trust calm too easily. Stability to him wasn't comfort. It was something you maintained. Something you checked, tightened, reinforced the same way he did with every strap, every bolt, every inch of rope that held his work together. It was why, on an ordinary afternoon that didn't feel like it would become anything more, he decided to go over his equipment again. Dusty stood quietly in the barn, her coat brushed clean, her breathing, even her body strong. In a way that still felt unreal when Ethan thought back to that first night. Sunlight slipped through the cracks in the wooden boards, falling in thin, angled lines across the floor. Ethan lifted the saddle from her back and set it onto a workbench. It was an old saddle, worn but reliable. He had cleaned it before, checked it before, trusted it without question. Until that moment. As he turned it over, the light caught something along the underside, a seam that didn't quite match the rest. Ethan paused. At first, it was just a feeling, a small shift in his attention. But then he leaned closer. The stitching there was uneven, not like the rest of the saddle, which had been crafted with steady hands and consistency. This part looked different, slightly thicker, slightly off, as if it had been opened once, and then closed again by someone who didn't care if it matched. Ethan ran his fingers along it. The leather felt firmer in that section, too firm. Something about it pressed against his instincts, the same quiet sense he had felt months ago when something about that broken tractor hadn't seemed right. The same subtle signal that told him something didn't belong. He didn't go back to cleaning. Instead, he stood still for a moment, staring down at the seam. Then he reached for a small knife. Carefully, he slid the blade under the uneven stitching and began to separate it. At first, nothing happened. Just resistance. Leather holding tight, like it had been sealed for years. Then slowly the seam gave. The leather peeled back just enough to reveal something underneath. A hollow space. Ethan stopped breathing. He widened the opening carefully, not tearing, not rushing. His hands were steady, but his heartbeat wasn't. Inside, tucked deep within the saddle, was a small metal box. He reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. Ethan set it on the workbench and stared at it, not afraid, but aware. That quiet instinct returned stronger now. Whatever was inside this box, it wasn't small, not in meaning. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in worn cloth, were gold coins. Real ones. Dull from age, edges softened from time, but unmistakable. Beneath them, a folded map. And beneath that, a leather-bound notebook. Ethan didn't touch anything for a long moment. He just stood there, letting the weight of it settle in. Then slowly, he picked up the notebook. The leather was cracked at the edges. The pages inside yellowed and uneven. When he opened it, the first thing he saw was a name written on the inside cover. Caleb Vaughn. Ethan frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to him. Not yet. He turned the page. The first entries were simple, practical. Notes about land weather patterns, harvest cycles. Numbers, observations. The kind of writing you'd expect from someone who lived close to the ground, who depended on it. But as he flipped further, something changed. The tone shifted. The handwriting pressed deeper into the page, as if each word had been written with more force. Caleb wrote about people, about helping them, about giving loans without interest, sharing crops when others had bad seasons, letting men stay and work his land when they had nowhere else to go. Ethan read slowly. And then the writing changed again. Shorter sentences, sharper edges, stories of those same people leaving, taking what they were given and not returning, asking for more instead of being grateful, turning away when Caleb needed something back. There was a line written darker than the rest. I thought helping was enough. It wasn't. Ethan swallowed. He could feel the shift in the man behind the words, the way hope had slowly turned into something colder. Page after page, the entries became shorter, more distant, until only fragments remained. And then, near the end, Ethan found the final pages. The handwriting there was sparse, controlled, like someone who had already said everything that needed to be said. One line stood out immediately. This is not a reward. It's a question. Ethan read it twice. Then he turned the page. The last entry. Trust the one who stays. That was it. No explanation, no instructions, no guidance on what to do next. Just a statement left behind for whoever found it. Ethan closed the notebook slowly. The barn felt quieter than before. He looked down at the gold coins in the box, then at the map. Then, without thinking, his eyes moved to Dusty. She stood calmly in her stall, shifting her weight slightly, ears flicking toward him, as if she could sense the change in him. Ethan sat down on the edge of the workbench. For a long time, he didn't move. Memories came back one after another. The cold night, the storm, the moment he had turned away, the moment he had come back. One more try. If he had kept walking that night, none of this would exist. The saddle would still be closed. The box would still be hidden. The journal unread. The question unanswered. Ethan exhaled slowly. The gold wasn't the point, not really. It could change things. Of course it could. It could make his life easier, safer, more comfortable. But that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the path that had led him here, the decision to stay, the decision not to walk away when it would have been easier. Ethan looked down at his hands. Rougher now, stronger, earned. The real question Caleb had left behind wasn't about finding the gold. It was about what someone would do after finding it. What kind of person they would choose to be when survival was no longer the only thing driving them. Ethan leaned back slightly, letting that thought settle. Because now he had a choice, a real one. He could sell the gold, all of it. He could leave Red Creek, go somewhere warmer, bigger, start over with money in his pocket and no reason to struggle the way he had. He could sell Dusty. A healthy mare now. Strong, reliable. She would bring in more than enough to start something new. No more cold nights. No more scraping for work. No more remembering what it felt like to nearly die out there in the snow. For a moment, the idea tempted him. Not because he was weak, but because it made sense. Then he looked at Dusty again, and the memory came back clear and sharp. Her trying to stand in the storm, falling, trying again. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. If he sold her, he would gain something. But he would lose something too. Something harder to define. Something Caleb had already lost once. Trust, not in others, in himself. Ethan opened the box again. He didn't count the coins, didn't calculate their value. Instead, he closed it, set it aside, then he walked over to Dusty and placed his hand on her neck. She turned her head slightly toward him. "You're not for sale," he said quietly. The decision came quickly, but it wasn't rushed. It had been building since that first night. Ethan didn't spend all the gold. He sold only a small portion, quietly, carefully. No announcements, no sudden changes that would make people ask questions. Just enough. Enough to buy a small piece of land at the edge of town. Enough to build a proper barn. Enough to ensure Dusty would never go hungry again. Enough to get better tools, better equipment. But not enough to change who he was. Ethan didn't want money to replace the work. He wanted it to support what he had already built. On that land, he started something small. A working place, not big, not impressive, but real. He took on more jobs, but only the ones he could do right. And slowly, he began to help others too. Not loudly, not publicly. If someone couldn't afford to have wood moved, he did it anyway. If someone needed tools, he lent them. If someone was struggling, he found a way to ease it without making it a spectacle. No signs, no advertisements, no stories told. Just quiet work. People didn't know about the gold. They didn't need to. All they knew was that Ethan showed up when it mattered, and somehow he managed to help without losing himself the way Caleb had. Years passed. The farm grew, not quickly, but steadily. Some people came and left, others stayed. There was always work, always something to fix, always something to build. Then one morning, a boy appeared at the edge of the property. He looked young, 17 maybe, thin, nervous, carrying everything he owned in a small bag. Ethan saw him from across the yard. The way he stood, the way he hesitated. It was familiar. The boy finally stepped closer and spoke. "Sir, I heard you let people work for a place to stay." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He just looked at him. Really looked. And in that moment he saw himself, standing in the cold, not knowing where to go, not knowing if anyone would say yes. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Noah." There was a pause. Then Noah swallowed and asked the question that mattered most. "What if I fail?" Ethan glanced toward Dusty. She stood calmly nearby, strong, steady, the same horse no one had believed in. Then he looked back at Noah. "Then don't walk away too soon. No promises, no guarantees, just truth." Ethan nodded toward the land. "You can stay. We'll see what you do with it." Noah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Time moved forward. The farm became more than just a place. It became something people returned to, not because it was easy, but because it was worth staying for. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the fields, painting everything in warm gold, Ethan stood with Dusty at the center of it all. The air was quiet. Still, Dusty's breathing was steady beneath his hand as he rested it against her neck. He looked out across the land, at the barn, at the fences, at the life that had grown from something so small. $10? One decision. One moment where he could have walked away. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "That was the moment everything changed," he said softly. And this time, he knew it was true. Years passed more quietly than Ethan expected, not because life had become easy, but because it had become steady. The farm grew the way things were supposed to grow. Slowly, without announcement, one season at a time. Fences repaired fields, cleared tools, replaced people coming and going. Noah was no longer the nervous kid who had stood at the edge of the property asking for a chance. He moved through the work with confidence, now handling tasks, without waiting for instructions, teaching others the same way Ethan had once guided him. And Dusty changed too. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first it was small things. A pause before stepping forward, a slight hesitation when turning. The way she no longer leaned into the harness with the same quiet strength she once had. Then the gray began to show along her muzzle. Her coat, once rough from neglect and later strong with recovery, softened into something thinner. Her steps grew slower, sometimes uneven. Not broken, just careful. Ethan noticed every detail. He didn't say anything about it. Instead, he adjusted. Dusty pulled less. Then, not at all. Ethan stopped giving her work that required strain. He let her wander the property instead, moving at her own pace, standing in the sun when she wanted, resting when she needed. She became less of a working partner and more of something else. A presence. A constant. Part of the place itself. One morning, Ethan knew something had shifted. It was early. The light was soft, stretching across the barn floor in long, quiet lines. Usually by the time Ethan stepped inside, Dusty would already be standing near the gate, waiting in her own calm way. But that morning, she wasn't there. He found her inside her stall, standing, but still. She didn't step forward when she saw him, didn't nudge the gate, didn't shift her weight in that familiar way. "Hey, girl," Ethan said gently. Dusty's ears moved, but her body stayed where it was. Ethan walked closer, slower than usual, as if sudden movement might break something fragile in the air. He checked her breathing. Steady. Her legs, no swelling. Her eyes, clear but distant in a way he couldn't explain. She ate when he offered feed, but slower. Drank, but less. Responded, but with a delay that hadn't been there before. Noah came in a little later and noticed it too. "Is she sick?" he asked quietly. Ethan shook his head after a moment. "She's just tired." The words settled heavily between them. Tired. It wasn't an illness you could fix. From that day on, the air around the barn changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone passing by would notice. But for Ethan, everything slowed. He found himself staying near Dusty more often, not working on anything specific, not trying to solve a problem. Just there, watching, waiting. Over the next few days, Dusty began to lie down more. At first, it was for short periods, then longer. She would stand walk a little, then return to the ground, folding herself carefully, as if she knew her strength needed to be preserved. Ethan sat with her when he could, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a hand resting lightly against her neck. He didn't go back to the books, didn't search for answers, because this time he already knew. This wasn't something he could repair, not something he could outwork, not something knowledge or effort would change. There would be no adjustment, no improvement, no hidden solution waiting to be discovered. For the first time since that night in the storm, Ethan understood something clearly. There was no one more try for this, and that didn't mean failure. It meant something else, something final. The morning it happened was quiet. There was no wind tearing at the barn walls, no snow driving through broken shelter, no urgency pressing in from the outside, just stillness. Soft light spilled into the stall as Ethan stepped inside. Dusty was lying down. At first, nothing seemed different. Then Ethan noticed. She didn't try to get up, not when she heard him, not when he moved closer. "Hey, girl," he said softer than he had in a long time. Dusty opened her eyes. She looked at him, fully present. But her body didn't move. Ethan knelt beside her. His hand found its place on her neck the same way it had that first night, the same way it had 100 times since. Her breath was still there, slow, even, not weak in the way of sickness, not strained, just slowing, like something that had been running for a long time and was finally reaching its natural end. Ethan didn't call for Noah, didn't go for help, didn't look for anything to fix. Because he understood. This moment didn't belong to anyone else. It belonged to them. He sat down beside her, leaning back slightly against the wooden wall of the stall. There was no panic, no fear, no desperate search for solutions, only quiet. Ethan's hand moved slowly along her neck, brushing through her thinning coat. "You did good," he said, his voice steady. Dusty's ears flicked slightly. "You stayed." Her breathing slowed further. Her eyes never left him. There was no struggle, no pain, no sudden movement. Just one breath. Then another, each one softer than the last, until there was a final long exhale. And then nothing. Ethan didn't move. His hand remained where it was. For a moment then, another, then longer, as if something might return, as if the space between breaths might fill again. It didn't. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, full of every moment that had come before. The storm, the struggle, the quiet mornings, the long days, the small victories. Ethan finally drew in a breath of his own. It shook slightly as it came in, but he didn't break, didn't collapse, didn't cry the way he might have years ago. Instead, there was something deeper. A hollow space, yes, but not empty, filled with memory, with meaning, with everything that had been built because she had stayed. He sat there for a long time, long enough for the light to shift, long enough for the world outside to continue without knowing anything had changed. When he finally stood, it was slow, careful, deliberate. The work that followed was quiet too. Ethan chose a place near the edge of the land, a spot that overlooked the fields where the horizon stretched open and unobstructed. Not a cemetery, not marked by anything formal, just ground that felt right. Noah helped him dig. He didn't ask many questions, didn't try to fill the silence. He understood enough. When they finished, they stood side by side for a moment. Noah looked at the fresh earth, then out across the land. "She saved this place, didn't she?" he said. Ethan nodded slightly. "Yeah, more than anyone knows." There were no speeches, no long words, just a quiet understanding. A stone was placed, simple, unmarked, enough. Life didn't stop after that. It never does. The farm continued. Work came in, people came and went. The seasons shifted the way they always had. But something had changed. Not in the land, in Ethan. He began to tell the story, not to everyone, not as something to boast about, but when someone needed it, when someone stood at the edge of leaving, when someone asked the same question Noah once had. Ethan never spoke about the gold, never mentioned the hidden saddle or the journal. That wasn't the part that mattered. Instead, he told them about the night, the storm, the moment he turned away, and the moment he came back. He told them about standing in the cold with nothing left and choosing not to walk away. That became the lesson. Not success, not reward, but staying. Years later, on another quiet evening, Ethan stood in the same field. The sun dipped low, casting everything in gold. Dusty wasn't there beside him anymore. But her presence remained, in the way the work was done, in the choices he made, in the people who stayed when they could have left. Noah stood not far away, speaking to a new arrival. Ethan caught part of the conversation. "What if I fail?" the newcomer asked. Ethan didn't need to hear Noah's answer. He already knew it. "Then don't walk away too soon." Ethan smiled faintly. The words had carried, not just as advice, as something lived, something proven. He looked toward the edge of the land where the simple stone rested under the fading light. For a moment he said nothing. Then quietly, almost to himself, "You stayed, so I could become someone who does the same." The wind moved gently through the field. Not harsh, not cutting, just enough to remind him it was still there. The same world, the same place, but not the same person. The sun slipped below the horizon, and this time the story didn't feel unfinished. It felt complete. For me, the story isn't really about perseverance or even redemption. It's about attention. Not the loud kind, but the quiet decision to truly see something the world has already dismissed. Ethan didn't change his life in one heroic moment. He changed it by refusing to look away, by noticing what others ignored, and staying long enough to understand it. The horse wasn't just something he saved, it was something that taught him how to pay attention to people, to work to himself. And maybe that's the deeper message sometimes. What transforms us isn't what we chase, but what we choose not to abandon when it would be easier to stop caring. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it meant something to you, even a little, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Your support truly helps keep these stories alive, and I can't wait to share more with you.